Thank you everyone for coming and listening to this talk through the syllabus and the exam materials. In this section, I'm going to walk through the components of the syllabi and show how it is intended to be useful for both exam candidates and prep providers in preparing for the exam. I'll be using the CIRE syllabus as an example, but all 9 syllabi have the same structure. Let's have a look at the CIRE syllabus. So first, we get an overview of the structure of the exam. And like I said, all syllabi will have this same structure. We're just looking at the CIRE exam. On this screen, we've got the exam parameters and the question weighting. The parameters are high-level details about the structure of the exam, the number of questions, and the time allocated to the exam. So in the CIRE, we have 2 hours, 110 questions. The questions will be multiple choice questions, and there'll be a maximum of 3 attempts at it. The question load throughout the 9 papers ranges from 75 questions to 120 questions. The time allocation ranges from 2 hours to 3 hours. However, the question time ratio is not a fixed thing across the syllabi. For example, CIRE, the one we're looking at now, has 110 questions across 2 hours, giving candidates just over a minute per question. Retail Securities has 120 questions in 3 hours, giving 1.5 minutes per question. Supervisor has 90 questions in 3 hours, giving 2 minutes per question. This difference in time reflects the difference in complexity of the syllabus and the resulting exam. This difficulty can also be reflected in the nature of the questions. CIRE is entirely made up of standalone multiple choice questions, as are the securities exams, the derivatives exam, and the trader exam. However, the supervisor, director and executive, CFO and CCO exams contain item set questions. Item sets are 5 items are questions, attached to a single scenario, creating a set. The scenario or vignette is typically quite a lengthy collection of information that needs to be interpreted and analysed to answer the associated questions. It takes longer to read the information, it takes longer to process the information, and the questions, as a result, are more complex and require a longer thought process, hence the longer time per question. The weighting. The question weighting shows elements covered in the syllabus. These, where possible, mimic the language of the competencies and sub-competencies in the CIRO competency profiles. With CIRE, and the retail and institutional securities exams and the derivatives exam, it's a little different. These 4 exams are derived from 2 competency profiles. So there's a little more creativity in the element titles than with, for example, the supervisor exam or the derivative or the director and executives exam. Nevertheless, all content is directly mapped to the relevant competency profile. Alongside each element is a set number of questions that will be allocated to that element. The weightings are governed partly by the amount of content in the element and partly by the relative importance to the person required to sit the exam. These weightings were discussed and agreed in the syllabus committee meetings and approved by CIRO. They're intended to give the exam candidate and the prep provider a good indicator on the scope of these elements and the relative amount of study effort required. Next in the syllabus document, we are presented with the syllabus key. The syllabus key explains the taxonomy of the syllabus learning outcomes. It's based on Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a hierarchical framework used to classify educational learning objectives into levels of complexity, from basic recall to higher order thinking skills. The CIRE is set at an introductory level. It'll focus on remember and understand, with a few questions set at the apply level. Other syllabi, such as supervisor, director executive, CCO, CFO, are more heavily weighted towards the apply and analyze terms. But let's look at what they mean and how they can help candidates and prep providers interpret the syllabi usefully to prepare for the exam. So we start with remember. Remember says, remember requires the candidate to recall information such as facts, rules, and principles. So under remember, we're going to have to define terms. We might need to select relevant items from a list or state a fact. The next level up is understand. Understand requires the candidate to demonstrate comprehension of an issue, fact, rule, or principle. So under that, you'll see questions that ask for candidates to describe a concept. Or if we flip that question, to recognize a concept from its description, or to explain the purpose of something. Next one up is apply. Apply requires the candidates to use information in new situations. So interpret what activity is occurring from a description. To implement actions or situations, so questions that ask what would happen next, what should happen, how should someone respond. Calculations will come into this too. On calculations, these are not math exams. Exams will use calculations where relevant to illustrate specific points, but it's not a significant portion of it. These are clearly indicated in the syllabi, the learning outcomes that have calculations, and some exams, such as CFO and derivatives, will naturally be more heavily weighted towards calculations, but they'll still not take up more than a significant minority of questions. The next step up is analyze. Analyze requires the candidate to review information and draw conclusions or make connections. So under this learning outcome, we'll be expecting candidates to compare and contrast two or more concepts or behaviors or products, to examine information and data and come to a conclusion based on that information and data, to differentiate between different actions and choose the appropriate one. These are often, but not always, the more detailed questions in the exam with longer stems and longer responses. Each syllabus document outlines this taxonomy, and then underneath each of those outlines, there are relevant examples of questions at the appropriate level. Then we get to the learning outcomes. Each element contains a list of learning outcomes. As mentioned, the learning outcomes are derived from the competency profiles. Where possible, the language mimics the competency profile. We have also been conscious of the testability of the learning outcomes. As someone who has used syllabi for 30 years to guide my teaching, my classroom materials, textbooks that I've written, questions that I've written, I'm very conscious of the value of a syllabus that can be interpreted effectively to understand not only what will be tested, but how it will be tested. And we've tried to work this into the syllabuses that we have created. In many of the syllabus committee meetings, some of the learning outcomes were discussed at length until there was clarity on how it indicated the type of questions that could arise under that objective. This is as important for question exam writers or exam question writers as it is for those sitting the exams and those providing prep materials and courses. The question writers are given specific learning outcomes from the syllabus to write to and are expected not only to reflect the content, but also the focus of that content at the appropriate level. The exam question writers are the same as the question writers for the practice exam. The practice exam questions are chosen from across the entire exam bank for that particular paper, all written questions had an equal chance of becoming a practice exam question. Those that did not became exam questions. Using this method ensured that the practice exam gives a very accurate reflection of the nature and difficulty of the actual exam. But just to be clear, because I know this is what would be going through my mind if I were in your situation, the questions in the practice exam will not appear in the actual exam. They've been removed from the actual exam bank. Back to the syllabus. You'll be pleased to hear that I'm not going to look through every learning outcome on the syllabus. I'm just going to pick out a few key learning outcomes to illustrate some key points. We'll start with element 1. You can see that at the top there's a brief summary of the content. It begins, this element requires candidates to be able to identify, describe and explain the purpose of the main investment industry regulators in Canada. And so it goes on. The purpose of the summary is to give an overview of the content, to allow specifically exam candidates a better opportunity to contextualize the learning outcomes that are to come. Because the learning outcomes are very factual and giving a little bit of narrative at the beginning just allows a little bit more of an ease into what's coming. We'll start with element 1. We'll have a look at 1.1. So 1.1 says, understand the role and authority of the Canadian Securities Administrators and provincial territorial securities and derivatives regulators. Consider, and then there's a list of bullet points. All right, interpreting the syllabus. First thing we should be doing is looking at the taxonomy. So the taxonomy on this one is understand. So we know that these are going to be recognized questions. These are going to be definition questions. These are going to be explanation questions. But it's not just recognize the CSA, understand the CSA, explain the CSA. It focuses us on what element of the CSA it wants us to look at. So it's the role and authority. And the question writers will be picking up on those terms, and they will be writing not just CSA generally, but the role and authority, which is still quite broad. So we then list down bullet points, and the bullet points will again further guide the question writers and therefore further guide the studiers and further guide the prep providers as well as to where the questions will be coming from. Now, the list is preceded by the word consider. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the use of the word consider in syllabus committee meetings, and it's an argument between consider and including. And preceding some lists, you see the word consider. Preceding some lists, you see the word including. And they do mean different things as far as an exam question writer goes, and therefore should mean different things from your point of view as well. So where it says consider, we are looking at a definitive list. So the question writer will only look at that list when they are writing the questions. So when thinking about the role and authority of the CSA, consider these bullet points. Whereas when you look at 1.11, further to the right of the page, you can see that this one says, remember the purpose and implications of other applicable laws, including. And using the word including says that this is not a finite list. So including, but not exclusively. So it could include other elements too. And it allows flexibility for changes, flexibility for additional laws that come in place. And it's not used very often in the CIRE exam, that it's quite ring-fenced in the content that it's got. But when we look at the other exams, such as securities, such as derivatives, such as supervisor, including is used much more than consider. And that's telling in the complexity of the syllabus and the expectation on the candidates sitting those exams. Okay, that's 1.1. Let's jump to 1.5. So 1.5, remember the functions and purpose of clearing agencies. Again, we've got the word consider. So there's only 2 clearing agencies that are going to be tested in this particular exam. Again, we look at the taxonomy. Taxonomy is remember. So here we're going to have questions that say define or select relevant facts or state a fact. But it's not just state a fact that CDCC is a clearing agent, it's focusing the questions as well on the function and purpose. So those definitions, those facts will be based not just on who our clearing agencies are, but the function of those clearing agencies and the purpose of those clearing agencies. So there's a couple of examples from element 1. I'll pick up another example from element 2. So element 2, let's look at 2.8, 2.9. So 2.8, 2.9. 2.8 says, understand the role of cost in product selection and understand the potential impact of fees, turnover, and taxes on the client's investment returns. Now, these could quite easily have been pushed into one learning outcome, particularly in this exam, the CIRO. However, we've decided to keep them separate for a specific reason. So firstly, we recognize that it is an understand learning outcome. So questions are recognize these from definitions or be able to define them or explain what they are. When we look at the difference between the two, yes, we've got additional information in 2.9, but there's another key factor to pick up as well. So in the first one, 2.8, it's about the role of cost in product selection. This is before the investor enters into the investment. So questions will be along the lines of, what are we paying for? Why are we paying for it? So how should that payment be viewed? What is the value chain? What is the value that's been added to these particular products through the cost? Whereas 2.9, the potential impact of investment returns, is after the investment. So once the investment has occurred, what is the impact of those elements on the investment returns, for example? So making those two separate learning outcomes is a key element of the syllabus construction. They could have been pushed together. We've kept them separate. It also tells us a relative importance of that. Pushing them together would mean there'd be fewer questions overall on those concepts. Separating them means there's likely to be more questions across those two concepts. And that's another way to read the syllabus. So looking at the question weighting against the number of learning outcomes within that element is a great way to say to yourself, well, this is likely how many questions per learning outcome are going to be in the exam. It's not rigid mathematics that we're using when we do that, but it is an indicator of the weighting of it. We try and balance it throughout the learning outcomes within each element. Element 3 then, again, we've got the summary at the top like we do for every element. What I want to focus on here is learning outcomes 3.7 to 3.12. Here we've got the learning outcomes that move around know your client, account appropriateness, know your product, suitability requirements, and they're great examples of how the syllabus will target the people who are required to sit the exam. So CIRE is required for our investment representatives and retail representatives, registered representatives. But our registered representatives also sit securities exams and possibly the derivatives exam. So these learning outcomes are designed to introduce the concepts of know your client, account appropriateness, know your product, suitability requirements at the level appropriate to investment representatives. So they need to understand these requirements. But a registered representative needs to have a knowledge beyond that. So in the securities paper, we will see these same concepts, but they will be taken to a higher level appropriate to registered representatives. They'll need to apply these requirements to specific situations. They'll need to analyze situations in which these requirements are applied. As I mentioned, we've been conscious of many readers when writing this particular syllabi. We have ensured that the syllabi reflect competencies. We've ensured that it considers what instruction they will give to those sitting the exam. And we've been conscious of allowing prep providers to interpret the content of the exam so that they are able to create effective learning materials and courses for the candidates who want them. As you can see, we've made the syllabus as instructive and informative as possible for all stakeholders, question writers, providers, and those sitting the exam. It's designed to give a thorough coverage of the competency profiles, strike the right balance of information at the right level of difficulty, and achieve that ultimate goal in creating robust and industry relevant examinations.